Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Prakash, for that exceedingly generous introduction. And to Nisha as well, as you said, an old friend from, I don't know how many years ago when I made a visit to Vimala College. But I'm exceedingly touched, Professor Prakash, by, first of all, by both your and, as you said, your colleague, Professor Shanmughadas, who have pursued me, I think, now for at least several years, I would say at least 5 or 6 years. Um, and I'm sort of ashamed and a bit exceedingly sorry about the fact that I haven't been able to actually visit the center, because I know that was our original plan. But just trying to coordinate my visits. I'm glad you mentioned my mother, because then she kind of takes precedence when I'm in Kerala, and then lots of other things come in as well. But we weren't able, unfortunately, to arrange a visit for me to actually come to the center. But Zoom and Google Meet and all these wonderful new technologies we have, um, in the midst of this terrible pandemic, and the fact that these technologies have stepped in to make things like this possible is something I think that we all have to be grateful for. So I'm not sure whether every 10th word of mine is a star, because I've always held on to the notion that good writing essentially is an ability to make good sentences. And it's really as simple as that, in my view. But of course, it also helps to have certain experiences and certain ideas and thoughts, and a kind of imagination that also obviously comes into play when it comes to the craft of writing. I decided that today I would talk. I have rehashed an article that I once wrote for a book that was called On Writing, which was edited by a friend and a colleague who many of you might have read, who's called Manju Kapoor. She's written a very beautiful book called Difficult Daughters, and others that have followed. But sometime after Difficult Daughters, she was commissioned by a publisher to produce a book on writing. And so she asked me, because by then I think I'd perhaps only had Ancient Promises published, or maybe a couple of other books after that. But the book which I think we all know that, has appealed the most to people, and certainly did to Manju Kapoor, was Ancient Promises. And so she asked me specifically whether I would give her an article about memoir writing, and what comes into play, and what happens as you begin to jot down memories, and try and craft that into a book or a novel. So the piece that I wrote for her, I've rehashed slightly and tried to make it work for today's lecture. It's not very long. I think takes about 15 or 20 minutes. So there will still be time, hopefully, for questions. I'm very, very conscious of the fact that there's lots of academics listening to me today, heads of departments of literature, centers around the area of Trichur. So I'm honored, I'm privileged actually to have such a glittering audience. I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I'm not an academic myself. So when I talk to college students, I'm fairly comfortable. When when I know that there are teachers in the audience, I start getting a little bit apprehensive, because as you probably know, my style of writing is actually quite simple. And I'm not very good at intellectualizing my work. I leave that to the academics, who do a brilliant job, and to the critics, who do a very good job as well. So this is just my view, a very personal sort of take on what happened to me while I started to write my memoir, and then to craft that memoir into a work of fiction. So I titled the essay, "The Truth About Fiction." On the top floor of my last house in London, it's not this house, but the previous one I lived in a small spare room that we grandly called the study, memory and imagination shifted and blurred while something slowly took shape. The process wasn't always slow. On certain days, it was like a terrifying roller coaster ride, uncontrolled and unstoppable. On others, the pace was halting, tentative, fearful almost. Stray conversations, scenes from an unhappy marriage, shame and anguish that were surely best left forgotten. This was the stuff of what was to become my first novel. Several books and media interviews later, I often wished for a less mundane beginning with which I could enthrall journalists, an epiphany or a voice pushing away inside me, but it started merely with a new desktop computer. This was the pre-laptop era when the currency of most writers was still paper and pen. I still have somewhere an old cardboard file full of handwritten short stories. But even a technophobe like me could see early on the potential offered by a machine that would allow a writer to slip waif-like in and out of a narrative, clipping ragged edges, shifting chunks of prose around, returning over and over again to an unsatisfying beginning that kept nagging. These were all the things that the new computer would allow with one click, I was told as my husband assembled its constituent parts amidst a colorful nest of wires. It was big and grey and seemed to be watching me blank-faced as I hoovered and dusted the room the following morning. Before leaving for work, my husband turned it on, opened a blank document, and told me to write 2 pages of text. Anything, even gibberish would do, he said. This was so that he could show me how to use basic word functions when he got back in the evening. He knew I wouldn't write gibberish, of course, and it was a ruse, I think, designed to uplift me. And oh yes, I needed that upliftment. I'd spent the past year training to be a broadcast journalist and had been the only student on my course to get that most glittering prize at the end of a truly grueling course, and that was a job at the BBC. 5 months into the job, however, I had to throw it all in when my mother's visa ran out, and my daughter's care made it impossible for me to continue working in the high-pressured environment of a breakfast shift newsroom. Some of you know that I have a daughter with special needs, and she was quite young at the time. So the gloom I tried covering up spilled over into the house, and the computer was probably meant to provide companionship in my suddenly enforced solitariness. Obediently, I sat down to my task, observing with suspicion the blank page that didn't look like a blank page at all, ringed as it was with a garland of hieroglyphs and icons. If I as much as touched one of them, the whole edifice would crash, I was sure. So I gingerly tapped a few keys and then used the button that I had been told would delete anything I had typed wrongly. Faintly empowered by the appearance and the equally obliging disappearance of letters, I started to craft my first sentences using both forefingers and a great deal of time to search for the right keys. Curiously, I continued to use an awkward 2-finger typing style 9 books on, but fortunately with much better levels of speed since those early labors. Writing what was to become my debut novel, I had initially only the haziest notion of a short memoir, a very short memoir, or perhaps a love letter to my husband, which would attempt to explain the events that had propelled both our lives to the place we were in today. What if I had been disciplined and stopped when I was meant to? What if the phone had rung and a friend had called me out for coffee? What if a book half read had beckoned or the weather had demanded that I tend to my weed-choked flower beds? None of those things happened that morning, and so I kept writing and writing. I felt little need to stop for food or drink. What was happening to me was apparently nourishment enough. Writers are told to avoid cliches, but I was not the first to experience that strange inability to keep from the writing, and others have already described that compulsion better than I could. New words are also inadequate to explain that opening of memory's floodgates, the cathartic release that refuses to be staunched when memoirs take shape. It was evening when I finally stopped writing that day. The toot of my daughter's school bus and the startling sight of the sun dipping beyond the plane trees lining the neighborhood basketball court revealed how long and how completely I'd been lost to the world while tracking memory's shadowed paths. Anxious and guilt-ridden, I tumbled down the stairs to open the door to the child I'd temporarily forgotten while creating her fictional self. The evening sun angled sharp brightness into the hallway as she rushed in pell-mell, strewing bag, bottle, sandwich box on the floor. The clamor of my flesh and blood child jolted me back, to real life. I watched my daughter, snack in hand, head straight for the TV as she usually did. After turning it on, she jumped onto her customary spot on the sofa, cushion onto her stomach, thumb into her mouth, her gaze remaining transfixed on the screen. Despite her special needs, she loved stories too. Such was their power, their utter seductiveness. I turned away, a fist clutching at my stomach. Something like that power could possibly be unleashed by the document slowly forming on the computer upstairs. If it grew into a book, as by then I knew it could, people would read it. It might influence them in the manner in which so many novels I'd read had moved me to change my perspective on things. That was an exciting thought, and yet one deeply alarming, because who was I to attempt writing something as ambitious as a book? Besides, telling my story would involve revealing my daughter's story too, and the stories of so many other people whose lives had intersected and overlapped with ours. My daughter could not give me informed consent, and all the other characters would in all probability not offer their consent at all. What gave me the right to choreograph the stories of all those people into a version that only I could control? That wasn't all. Shaping real life into a readable narrative would involve editing out various people, collapsing inconvenient, event-poor sections, shrinking timelines, expanding other incidents for dramatic effect, narrating everything from my point of view and my point of view alone. Essentially, the process of writing would need to render real life less real. Did writing a memoir give me the authority to do that? I didn't know. I'd never written anything of substance before, leave alone a memoir. One simple fact I did learn in the days that followed, however, was that I simply could not ignore the thing that was growing on my computer. Like a demanding child, it cried out for my attention, and I was helpless against its attractions, drawn to lavishing care on it whenever possible, and brooding over it whenever not. Day would dawn, and I waited to be left alone with a selfish fervor that startled me. After my husband and daughter disappeared into the world outside, a place that was suddenly not so alluring anymore, I would dart upstairs to the blissful cocoon of my study as though on an urgent and secret assignation. When the computer came on with a gentle ping and the words I had written the previous day materialized on screen, all maternal and domestic concerns fell right away, inconsequential, trivial even in the face of this, my new love. And so my memoir grew. And while I bared my heart, further concerns developed alongside what might happen to this narrative. The possibility of publication was hard to resist. But did I have whatever it took to display the minutiae of my life to a curious and often unforgiving world? I would be accused of being narcissistic and self-indulgent, quite deservedly. But then I had read and I had loved Nora Ephron's Heartburn, and I had laughed at her famous line, "Everything is copy, everything is copy." Apart from beginning to see the truth in that, I recalled how reading Ephron's wry and wise account of the breakdown of her marriage had been like a salve when my own first marriage had ended. Wasn't it worth writing something that someone, anyone, might derive reassurance or comfort from? On the other hand, my recent journalism course had made me consider the ethics of intruding into private lives, even when arguments of public interest and social responsibility applied. Writing memoir wasn't far off from that territory, if I was to be honest. I wondered if writers like Hanif Qureshi and Philip Roth had struggled similarly while mining their own lives over and over again for literary material. After all, Zuckerman, Roth's alter ego, did describe memoir as being the most manipulative of literary forms in the book The Facts, the novelist's autobiography. All these questions crowded my head only fleetingly, because the only thing that continued to be imperative at that point was to continue to allow the story to seep out of wherever it was that I had shut it away for more than a decade. And so I wrote on in those weeks, shaping memories into a narrative that was deeply personal, but also had, I have discovered since several elements that others would recognize: a teenage romance thwarted, a hastily arranged marriage, the birth of a disabled child, the unraveling of a marriage, the search for a lost love. Such experiences are not likely to be universal, but the language of heartbreak and hope certainly is. All along, I fictionalized, changing names and tweaking events, pulling them this way and that so that their shape would become unrecognizable to anyone looking to point a reproachful finger. Fear frequently loomed over my shoulder, and yet I wrote and wrote. Christmas was approaching, when only a couple of chapters remained, and I felt a new anxiety. The solitariness in which my writing had thrived would be broken by the holidays when both my husband and my daughter would be around, filling the silence with their noise and with their needs. Their uncomplicated joie de vivre and the easy glitter of tinsel and festive celebrations would surely damage the fragile thing that I was trying to create. I felt oddly protective of my project and resentful at the thought of removing myself from it for what now looked like frivolities. Another rule was making itself known to me. Writers need to be selfish beings, obsessive and preoccupied by their craft. Family life ran counter to creativity. That was what Virginia Woolf had meant when she wrote, "Killing the angel in the house is part of the occupation of a woman writer." Through the blaring television and the din of rock music, I wrote on, regardless. The invitations to Christmas dinners, holiday pub crawls, the compulsory shopping, they all came and went, while I watched through a kind of lens that had rendered everything once removed and unreal. The only thing that seemed real was the fiction that was spinning itself out on my computer, now a nearly completed story. Most of it took place in a far-off time and place, in the Delhi of my childhood, and in lush verdant Kerala that had contained my years of unhappiness. What madness caused me to want to relive a difficult period of my life in order to write convincingly of it, a process that was both punishing and yet cleansing as it drew to a close. No more did I regret having written it, because by now it was clear that I had simply not had the choice to do otherwise. And then one day, sitting at my desk, I kept my finger pressed on the hyphen key, watching with satisfaction as a line formed under the bottom of my now completed manuscript. My novel was done. Aspiring writers asked me about that moment, and now I'm glib with all the information I did not know then. Never ever send an agent a first draft. Rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. You simply cannot edit enough. Perhaps I omitted to mention the poems that kept pace with my writing, for fear of putting off promising authors before they'd even started. But because all writers will recognize those doubts at some point or another, and because they will need to become robust in facing the many travails of a writer's life, I do them a disservice. Very difficult too is the other question I get asked rather a lot. How much of your novel is true? Some readers even pin me down to individual pages and experiences, pressing me for a clear-cut answer, keen to know that the sympathy they expended as they read was not wasted on a made-up character. What they forget, as I often did when I wrote, is how relative a concept truth is. There is never a sole truth, not in any story. John Berger, in his novel G, says, "Never again shall a single story be told as though it were the only one." A line that many of you will know Arundhati Roy uses as an epigraph in her own autobiographical novel, The God of Small Things. All writers know this fact, or at least they learn it as they begin to experiment with point of view. Some, like Philip Roth, have had to accept it more painfully when their ex-spouses go on to write their own rival memoirs. The only thing I can say with any certainty is that I was true to my own story and to the way in which I wrote it. And by that I mean that there was no dissembling between myself as a writer and myself as the person on whose life the story had been based. The honesty that writers bring to their first books is, in fact, one of the most difficult things to recapture later. For once an author is assured of publication, the gaze shifts outwards to agents and editors and publishers, and of course to readers, who would be the first to recognize writing, fictional or otherwise, that did not ring true. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello.
Thank you, ma'am.
Was I audible throughout? Because it went very silent and I suddenly thought I lost my audience.
Very clear. Very audible.
Okay, good. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful and beautiful talk. Now the floor is open for discussion. And a few of our participants have asked their questions earlier, so I would just call out to them. And would you please ask the question? Now, we have a question from Meera Kasharaman, who is a research scholar at Vimala College, Thrissur. Meera.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can see your face, but I'm not getting a gallery view. Never mind, carry on.
Yes, ma'am. So it's an absolute delight to hear you speak as always.
Thank you.
My question for you is, be it fiction, be it a memoir, you have once compared your writing to a tap that can never be completely turned off. So I was wondering whether it is fiction or memoir, when you start writing, in the process of writing, does the thought of a potential reader's response hamper your flow, or do you have a reader in your mind as you write? Are you a reader's writer?
Good question. And I think perhaps that was what I was referring to when I said in this lecture that I gave, that the only book that you write, perhaps, I mean, I don't know whether this differs to other writers, but the only book that you write without a reader or an editor or a publisher in mind is your very first book. Maybe that's stating the obvious, but at that point in time, it all feels very, very internal. What you're doing is for yourself, and you are just trying to be true to your own thoughts, to your own story. So subsequent to that, once you've actually been published, I think that gets harder and harder to achieve. Because inevitably, you write a sentence and you think, oh, I know my agent isn't going to like that. Or you sort of think, if it's going to be the same publisher who published me last time, they're going to say, this book is too similar to the last one, so maybe you need to try something. And you can't get those faces and those voices out of your head. It's unfortunate, because that's where the honesty of a book starts to bleed away, starts to get lost. So if it can be recaptured, I would say that is the ideal thing to do, is basically to write without anyone else in mind and write purely for yourself. But impossible. I would be the first to admit.
Right, ma'am. Thank you. It was very candid of you to discuss. Thank you, ma'am.
I hope.
Thank you, Meera. And we have a question from Dr. Shanmughadas, who is Assistant Professor at St. Thomas College, Thrissur. Shyam, sir.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, it was great listening
Hello,
to
Professor.
you.
I'm terrified when teachers ask me questions.
Oh my God. Yeah. So it was great listening to you, actually. It's a wonderful session.
Thank you.
And can you share with us some of your, the idea of the process of writing, like how a small thought or a memory comes into your mind, and then you recollect from that, you take things out of that memory, and how do you connect it with the places and other stuff around you? So, I mean, my basic question is that how do you write, the very process of writing and the thought behind it? So, because I asked this question because, of course, Tagari Shivashankara Pilla, he, most of his writing, I think, we can place it as a social memory. But in your writing, it becomes more or less like a personal thing when you write memoir. So, can you just talk about it?
I think you've hit that on the head quite nicely, actually, with what you just said, is that my writing is quite, I mean, I seem to have a kind of visual track that's running through my head when I start to write a book. And so I'm actually seeing the story spin out in front of me. I mean, it's not necessarily, only with Ancient Promises was it so purely autobiographical. So I was probably seeing memories that were going through my mind. But where I have written more kind of pure fictional work, I think what I still continue to see is like a cinema track sort of running through my head. But I'm seeing those characters and I'm seeing the setting in which they are. And so when I wrote historical fiction, for instance, the story of Rani Lakshmibai, I was actually in, the 1850s. I was in Jhansi. I'd done enough research by then to have formed a mental picture of what the town would have looked like. And so I was on horseback when she was riding into the forest. All those kind of, it's sort of, I seem to have to live out or at least view the experience that I'm going to be writing about before I can write about it. I wish I knew how Tagriyamavan did his writing, because these were questions that wouldn't have occurred to me at the time when I had the luxury of being able to talk to him. I wasn't a writer at that point. I didn't think I was going to be a writer. So, but yeah, I don't know, when you say social memory, that's quite an interesting phrase, and I need to think about that. I need to kind of reread maybe something of his and try and see how that happens. But you're right, there's probably something that is lacking in my work. So the bigger picture, the bigger canvas.
Okay, thank you, Shyam sir, for your question. Thank you, ma'am. And Kripa Ravindran, of Assistant Professor at Sri Kerala Verma College, Trishur. And she has a question. Kripa, please.
Ma'am, I hope I'm audible to you. Thank you so much
for
that delightful talk. It was a wonderful experience listening to you. It was as if reading your book, and what Prakash sir said, like the star words that you've written, and you've inspired us as a writer. And my question is about your view on disability studies, the interconnectedness of life writing, precisely memoir and disability studies. Being a person who has got a qualification in special education and dealing with differently abled people, how do you see about, what do you think about the therapeutic effect of life writing on, disability or disability studies?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think I tend to see the two worlds, the way they work in my mind, I tend to see them as two very separate things. I don't think I interlink them together very much, which is probably very unhelpful in terms of giving you a response to your very intelligent question. The reason, I mean, one thing which I know I'm keen to do one day, and I don't know whether I'll ever succeed or whether I'll be able to get around to doing it, is to write the story from the point of view of someone like my daughter, who actually doesn't have language and doesn't have words and lacks large tracts of understanding. She has her own kind of understanding, but not in the way that you or I might be able to, I might think of it. So I have toyed with the idea of getting into her head or the head of someone else like her who sees the world differently, and maybe that would become a kind of something that, say, like you say, disability studies people might appreciate or might relate to. But I still, I don't think I see the way I write fiction or what I'm writing about, unless there is a character like my daughter in it, I don't see it as being particularly related to disability studies. What I do in the disability sector is different to what I do. I sort of take off that hat and put on another one when I come back to my fiction writing. So there isn't that joined upness for me yet. Let's see.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kripa. And now, Shanmughadas sir. Sir, would you like to ask a question, sir? Sir, your audio is mute. Can you please unmute yourself, sir?
I would like to ask you about your relationship with cinema. I think you have mentioned somewhere in one interview that you were going to write a script some years back to my friend Chandrasekhar. Some years back, maybe in 2003, that you were about to write a script or something. One thing. Second thing, I have read your article about your experience as a member of that certification board, British, not censor board. I think it is certification board or some sort. So something
Classification.
about the world of films, your relationship to it, whether you wrote that script and such things. I do not know that.
The script writing, I helped the person who bought the film rights to my second book, Accidents Like Love. I don't know if that was what I was referring to at the time, but I helped him to write. He actually wrote the script himself, and he just came to me as a kind of for a consultancy. He used to sort of check if certain things would work and so on. So we sat together for maybe 2 or 3 days when I was in Delhi, and we wrote the script together for just that length of time. Subsequently, he's done a lot of his own writing and so on. So I don't think I can take any credit for script writing. And unfortunately, he didn't have any success with getting it sold to a producer at that point in time. But now that we have all these, what they call, I hear this language from him and from a couple of other filmmaker friends. It's a world that's completely lost to me, is what they call OTT platforms and, platforms like Netflix and Amazon and so on. He's giving it another shot. So he's saying rather than a film, maybe we'll be trying for a series. And so I've left all that to him. I just don't think I'm qualified to do that. But I'm glad you mentioned my stint with the British Board of Film Classification, because that was a real eye-opener for me. I don't know whether you read an article I wrote about a censorship for, I've forgotten who had, Jai Arjun Singh, I think, did an anthology of writings on film.
Yes.
And I
think I read that particular article.
Maybe that was the one. Yeah,
Right.
perhaps. Because in that I talk about, you see, when I joined the Board of Film Classification here, I had already had the experience of being censored. I'm trying to remember the exact sequence of events because, my writing and my work with the BBFC kind of overlapped for a number of years. But I came to understand so much better the whole idea of censorship. I won't say I came to accept it, because I think as a writer, there would still be a part of me that would want to resist that. But the dichotomy and this sort of strange paradox of being in a situation where I was a writer and believed in total freedom of expression, and where I was working for a body which is in this country sort of semi-autonomous. It's not really a government body, but they have the director of the board is chosen by the government. So there is definitely a connection. But to suddenly become part of a body that is dealing with other people's creative works and sort of bringing in the idea of censoring them. And at first mentally I had a sort of bit of a rebellion and I didn't know quite what to do with it. I wanted the job, so I didn't tell them at the interview that I had all these libertarian ideas. But once I was there, I started to understand certain things, and I started to see that there is something called society, there is something called big sort of, something sort of bigger than us as individuals that needs to be protected in its own way. So I developed a certain sense. I still don't agree with the censorship of books, because I believe that's a completely different thing to the kind of things that we were having to censor as film censors. But yeah, it was and continues to be, when I look back on that time, it continues to be an area that still, I would admit, confuses me. I'm not entirely sure where exactly I stand on the issue of censorship, because I've come to believe through my work at the BBFC that there is no such thing as total freedom of expression. That we simply cannot, as a civilized society, one cannot have that luxury, unfortunately. But this is what I've come to believe. Does that make any sense? If you have any follow-up question, anyone else, please feel free. I'm not sure I've explained it very well.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Das, sir, for the question. Ma'am, we have a question from Chetan Chandra. He's asked, why have you used Jhansi Rani as a protagonist of the novel Rani? What is the intention behind it?
It started off with just me wanting to write a story about a strong Indian woman. So these three boxes had to be ticked. From history, I decided I wanted it to be from the period of history where Britain was ruling India, or at least when they were already present in India. Because I was living in the UK and I knew that I would have access to archives and papers over here. So that those few things were clear in my mind. And when you put those few bits together, one of the most obvious choices is Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, because not only did she, strong Indian female character, she fought the British. She lost her life at a very young age, tragically, on the battlefield. I mean, it was just altogether such a romantic sort of idea, such a romantic character, that it seemed almost as if I need not look anywhere else. But because she was so obvious, I actually turned away from her for a long time while I was still trying to decide whom I should write about. So I turned away from her and I looked at all sorts of other characters, the Begums of Bhopal and Begum Hazrat Mahal, who also plays a big part in the 1857 uprising. So many other interesting. I mean, I don't think I realized until that point how many strong Indian female characters we have in that period of history. So in a way, I was spoiled for choice. But there was something, because in the first bits I'd read up about Lakshmibai, I went back, I read up a little bit more. I just couldn't seem to get her out of my mind. These are these kind of slightly mystical things that come into play when you are a writer, and I'm sure other writers in this audience will identify with aspects of that, is that there is some things that you feel totally compelled by in a way that you simply can't explain to people. It's like that tap, the dripping tap that I can't turn off, that was mentioned earlier on in this conversation. I kept returning to Lakshmibai. She kept haunting me in a way. It was as if she was looming over my shoulder when I was looking at other people's stories and getting briefly tempted. And then it's as if she would tap me on the shoulder and say, I'm still here. So I reached a point where I knew it had to be her story. And it's really as simple as that. And I don't think I regretted it, because I grew to admire her more and more and more as I researched and wrote and got into her head. She's truly she was a person with a very modern sensibility. She genuinely was a figure way before, way ahead of her times. So and died so tragically. I don't think she was even 30. There's no very definite age of, they're not very sure how old she was, but I think she was about 29 or 30. So yeah, I'm glad I got the chance to briefly give her a bit of life again, breathe a bit of life into her again.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, there's a question from Sandeep Kevi, who's assistant professor at Sri Kerala Verma College, Thrissur. How can a memoir be significant in the age of digitalization, and how does a reader differentiate between fact and fiction?
Very good. This, I have a very similar thoughts when you say the age of digitalization. I mean, I'm assuming what you're referring to, partially at least, is social media. Because these are the things that I think about when I see how social media has, come to dominate our lives. It's as if all of us are writing, should we say memoirs, or writing our own stories all the time. And we write them imaginatively, we write them in a sort of slightly exaggerated way, because we know that's what works on social media. We have to tell the story really powerfully. So we put photographs. I mean, you would have seen me, perhaps some of you would have noticed that just before this discussion started, I was taking pictures of the screen, because I want to go, as soon as this is finished, I want to go on Twitter and I want to put on there my day's experience of talking to the academics and the students of the Thrissur area in Kerala. I mean, it's something which I know I can make a little story out of. I can actually tell anyone. I mean, it's not as if I have a vast amount of followers, but I'm quite new to the world of digital media and to social media myself. So but I'm conscious of the fact that this is what people do. I go to a restaurant in London and we sit down to a meal, and at the table next to us, I see it's usually young people, but now I think everybody's doing it. And the lovely meal has just been put in front of this girl, and before she can get in there with her fork and knife, she's whipped out her phone and she's taking photographs of it, and she's sort of jabbing on her fingers on her phone because she wants to put it on Instagram, or she wants to send it immediately to her followers wherever they are across the world. So this business of telling our stories has become universal, and I think it's changing the way we think, it's changing the way we live our lives. I actually find it a bit frightening because I think it's almost as if there's an alternative reality and people are living in that rather than their own lives, or anything they do in their own lives is kind of dominated by the idea that it should fit into that alternative life and make everything look good. So it's very different to actually writing a memoir the way I wrote it, which was a lot of events had finished and then I sat down and wrote it all down. But it is still about the self, isn't it? And it's about what, as I mentioned in my lecture, point of view. You're showing the world yourself from your point of view. And it's actually quite important to remember that the world doesn't see you the way you see yourself. The world brings its own point of view to you. So it's going to create lots of very interesting ways of being and writing, I think, this digitalized new world of ours. Not so new now, but we're all a part of it now.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, we'll take one last question. It's from Hima S. And she asks, in most of your works, you criticize Indian/Kerala system of marriages, which give least importance to individual choice. Do you consider the system of marriage still patriarchal?
Still, what was the last word?
Patriarchal.
Patriarchal. Okay. I would take issue slightly with the idea that I'm criticizing say a Kerala way of doing things or an Indian way of doing things, or even sort of the idea of arranged marriages. Far from it, because I think in some ways Janu, the character in Ancient Promises, agrees to an arranged marriage because she's surrounded by actually very happy arranged marriages. So she has seen her own parents. There's the Ammavan and Ammai in the story. Vijay Mami, who's definitely based on my own Ammai, who loves the fact that she's in the book. But because there are so many successful stories surrounding Janu, she kind of believes that she can create this kind of happiness for herself. So by no means was there an intention to rubbish the idea of the arranged marriage system. Having said that, I mean, I must sort of draw a distinction between arranged marriages and forced marriages. And obviously, there's no, I would have very little sympathy with the idea of forced marriages. You see them in the UK as well, actually. So it's not merely a feature of Kerala or of India. But I think when you use big words like patriarchy, there is a kind of nagging concern I have that in Kerala we are gradually moving to a more patriarchal kind of way of doing things or a way of thinking. I mean, and I realize the matrilineal, whatever the matriarchal, whatever you want to call it, ideas that the Naya communities, that was my sort of the historic communities kind of developed and grew up with. They had their own flaws, but the fact is women were far more empowered by that system than they seem to be today. So I don't know whether the influences have come from the north, have trickled down, or whether these ideas come from movies, Hollywood, or something. But the more I look around me, I'm beginning to see that there's a sort of patriarchy at work, even in liberal, quite high-minded Kerala. And I despair. I despair at the idea that even a place that's as literary and as educated and as should be so forward-thinking as Kerala, we sort of remain, or we're becoming more and more mired in a very deep-rooted kind of conservatism and a kind of inability to break away from traditions that have long outlived their time. So, I mean, would hate to end on a negative note, and I'm very conscious of the fact that that I'm talking to to some very academic intellectuals from Kerala, and I'm sure you have your own ideas, and I'd have loved to hear them. But this is my fear, and maybe from afar things look different. Maybe being there would be changing my mind a bit more. I do go back very frequently, obviously, but from what I seem to be picking up on, maybe I hope they're the wrong signals, but I sort of I feel concerned. I mean, even how many years? About 20 years since Ancient Promises was written. And if you think that I wrote the book Ancient Promises 10 years after those events had happened to me. So let's say the story is about 30 years old and more. I still get emails from predominantly young women, college students, sort of telling me, I loved your book because I identify so much with it. I know exactly how Janu feels, the same things happening. And that worries me because I'd have thought that 30 years on, all of that would be well in the past, but it doesn't seem to be. So I don't know whether we're just staying the way we always were or whether things are regressing in some way. But it is a genuine fear of mine on behalf of Kerala.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, shall we have one last question?
Yeah.
No, this
I
is
haven't
from
even looked
Sandhya.
at my watch. I mean, it's fine. I did text my mum just before starting, saying I'm going to call you
okay,
later.
ma'am. This will be the last question, ma'am. So Sandhya, research scholar from St. Thomas College, Thrissur, has a question. Sandhya? Sandhya, are you in? Okay, I'll ask a question. What is the greatest pressure that the upcoming writers of this generation face? She asks, what is the greatest pressure that the upcoming writers of this generation face?
I heard a publisher talking about this, and it was a good couple of years ago. If anything, the situation has gotten worse since then. And they said they were talking about digitalization again that we mentioned earlier, and they said what lies ahead for us is a bloodbath. I first thought he's being a bit dramatic. This was the CEO of Penguin Random House, the big. And I thought, surely that can't be true. I mean, I think there'll always be a need for books. People will always read. Publishers will always have to publish. But just from looking around, I think, and from people I know who are trying to write and trying to get published, it's actually is getting tougher and tougher. And the reasons for it are manifold. I think you can't just blame digitalization or social media, the distractions from all these platforms we mentioned earlier, Netflix and so on. That's partly it, and it's also partly the fact that publishers have got enormous budget cuts, so they're not taking as many risks as they used to. So for a brand new writer, that's not good news, because the people who are getting published are the ones who have already been published. So they're not taking very risky decisions. And even people who've been published don't necessarily get new books published if they haven't had the right sales, if they haven't sold enough numbers that the publishers need. So it's the same old bunch of relatively successful writers who will keep getting published and republished. And the other challenge, and this was the one that I personally find difficult, and in some ways has caused me to turn away from writing a little bit. As I don't know how many of you are aware that I'm now doing much more of my sort of charitable work rather than writing. And I'm not particularly missing the writing as well. It's because I'm so conscious of how much self-promotion you have to do. And I think, talking about the young woman with the phone ready for her Instagram page, maybe it comes easier to younger people or something, and good luck to them, because I think if you do have those skills, then it really does help. But publishers expect you to do your own publicity. You're expected to be on every single one of these platforms. You're expected to sell yourself all the time. And if you're the sort of typical writer who just wants to be left to sit and write and not be bothered with the world out there. It's actually very difficult to do. It's very awkward to have to keep jumping up and down saying, read me, read me. But if you look at the successful writers around these days, the ones who are actually selling in thousands, they are the ones who are out there unashamedly kind of selling themselves. And like I say, good luck to them. But if you have to be that kind of a character these days to become a writer. You can't, it won't be enough to just say, I write really beautifully, will you publish me? The publisher will want you to want to see that you've got a big Instagram following and that you've got a big Twitter following or whatever before they'd even look at you. So it's become a part of the writing, the publishing process, unfortunately. So it's less attractive in my view.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Sandhya, for that question. Okay, I think so. That's it with the questions, and we have officially come to the end of our program, and so a good. I'm just okay. Thank you, Sandhya, in proposing the vote of thanks. So, a good memoir reads like a novel. It describes settings vividly and dialogues illustrate incidents naturally. Memoirs dive deep into the most intimate memories, exploring emotional truths and the way they make us feel. It takes us back in time and is certainly stranger than fiction. Respected Chief Speaker of the Day, Jaishree Misra, Prakash Sir, Shanmughadas Sir, members of Center for English Studies and Research, Thrissur, and dear participants. We at CESR are greatly honored and thank eminent author Jaishree Misra for accepting our invitation to be part of our 14th annual lecture, despite her hectic schedule. Thank you, ma'am, for your beautiful introspection on the topic, Memoir, Truth About Fiction, and the various nuances of memoir writing. Words cannot express our love to Prakash Sir and Shanmughadas Sir, the heart and soul of CESR, for the unstinting support and care they have given to the organization since its inception. Thank you, sir, for organizing this lecture. I also thank Shubha ma'am and the other members of CESR for their care and concern. I express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Sister Veena Jose, Principal of Vimala College, Thrissur, Dr. Nisha Francis Alapat, Head of the Department of English, and the faculty members for their technical support in hosting this platform. I thank Professor Ambika V, Principal of Sri C. Achyuthamenon Government College, Thrissur, and Anna Placid, Head of the Department of English, for their support and help. And the final words of heartfelt thanks goes to our dear participants for their active involvement and queries, and to all those who made this lecture a success. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.